Can I borrow $5? Annie spoke. She looked up at Richard Whitmore with eyes so honest they almost seemed to plead. Richard looked her over from head to toe, the thin coat frayed at the cuffs, the old shoes worn at the toes, the small hand clutching a crumpled $10 bill, as if it were the only thing standing between her and something terrifying. $5? He asked. Annie nodded quickly. It was only a small nod, but it seemed to wound her pride more than any refusal could have. Yes, sir, she said. Just $5. Please. The 24-hour pharmacy was almost empty at that hour. The aisles sat still beneath harsh white lights, the kind of lighting that made every tired face look even more exposed. Behind the checkout counter, the pharmacist held a small white medicine bag in his hand. He glanced at Annie, then at Richard, his expression uncomfortable but not surprised. The medicine is $15, he said. She only has 10. Annie turned back to the counter and pushed the $10 bill forward, as if presenting it one more time might somehow change the number on the screen. It was $10 last week, she said. Her voice was strained, but she was still trying to keep it steady. I bought the same one last week, right here. I thought this would be enough. The price changed, the pharmacist said quietly. His voice was not cold, but it carried the helpless weariness of a man who had repeated the same sentence too many times to people who did not have enough money. Richard picked up the bottle of aspirin he had placed beside the card reader. He had not paid yet. His gaze remained on Annie, cautious and distant. So you ran here to buy medicine, he said, but you only brought exactly $10? Annie swallowed. That's all I have. Richard's eyebrow lifted slightly. You didn't think to bring extra money just in case? Annie's face tightened. There is no extra. The answer was short, but it left the air between them quiet for a moment. Richard looked at the medicine bag in the pharmacist's hand, then at the $10 bill on the counter. And now you're standing here borrowing money from a stranger. Annie's cheeks reddened with shame. She lowered her head for a second, then forced herself to look him in the eye again. My mother needs it, she said. Her asthma got worse tonight. Her old inhaler is empty. I ran here because this pharmacy stays open all night. I really thought $10 would be enough, because that was what it cost before. Richard did not answer right away. He turned the aspirin bottle in his hand, though his eyes were not on the label. If it's such an emergency, he asked, why didn't anyone come with you? There isn't anyone else. The words were simple, but some simple sentences carry the weight of an entire lonely life. Richard looked at the thin coat on her shoulders, then at the lonely $10 bill on the counter. A person who doesn't even have $5 to buy medicine, he said evenly. How can she guarantee she'll pay me back tomorrow morning? Annie's face burned. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I work in the morning, she stammered. I clear tables at a diner on Ashland before the breakfast rush. I get paid after my shift. I can come back here, or I can meet you anywhere you want. I swear I'll pay you back. Richard watched her. Do you do this often? Annie blinked. Do what, sir? Come into pharmacies in the middle of the night, come up short, and ask someone else to cover the difference. His voice was not loud, but each word landed clearly. Is this how it usually works? The pharmacist looked down, suddenly busy with the label on the medicine bag. Annie's shoulders drew in slightly, but she did not cry. She only took a slow breath, as if she had to remind herself to stay standing. No, sir, she said. I don't usually ask anyone for anything. That's what everyone says. I know. Her voice trembled, then steadied again. I know how it sounds. I know you don't know me. I know I look like someone who walked in here unprepared and now wants your money. But my mother is at home struggling to breathe. And I'm standing here with $10 for medicine that is now $15. I don't have a better explanation than that. Richard looked at her for a long time. Most liars grew quiet when stared down. Annie did not. She stood there, pale with humiliation under the pharmacy lights, still trying to keep her back straight because someone at home was waiting for her to bring that medicine bag back. The pharmacist cleared his throat. She was here last week, he said. She paid in full. Same prescription. Richard glanced at him. The pharmacist added, I can't release the medicine without full payment. Store policy. Annie quickly turned back to Richard. Sir, you can write down my name if you want. Annie Johnson. I'll give you the address of the diner. I'll give you my apartment number. I only need $5 until tomorrow morning. Richard still did not soften. He had met too many people who knew how to swear by family, illness, misfortune, and another person's compassion, only to disappear the moment they got what they wanted. $5 meant nothing to him. But the money was never the real issue. What he hated was the feeling of being used. And Richard Whitmore hated being fooled more than he hated losing money. People promise a lot when they need money, he said. Then once they get what they want, they disappear. Annie's lips parted. I won't disappear. How would I know that? She did not have a ready answer good enough. She looked at the $10 bill, then at the medicine bag waiting behind the pharmacist's hand. Because I'm telling you the truth. Richard let out a short breath without humor. Words are easy. That struck her harder than his first suspicion. Annie lifted a hand to the edge of her coat, her fingers gripping the thin fabric as if she needed something to hold on to. I'm not trying to steal from you, she said very softly. I didn't say you were stealing. You said I would disappear. Richard looked at her. For a moment, the pharmacy seemed to grow colder. Annie swallowed and blinked several times, but she did not let the tears fall. Richard set the aspirin down. I don't even know you. What if I lend you the money and you don't pay me back? Then, Annie stopped. Her throat tightened with shame as she tried to defend her honor over an amount of money this man might never even remember. Then you can come to the diner. I already told you where I work. What if that isn't true? It is true. Do you have a phone? Annie hesitated. Yes, sir. Then call a relative, a cousin, an aunt, a neighbor. Ask them to send you $5. Standing here begging a stranger probably takes longer than making a phone call. Annie's expression fell. Richard saw it, though he did not understand it at first. She lowered her eyes to the prescription she held close to her chest, then slowly shook her head. There's no one to call. Everyone has someone to call. No, sir, Annie said. This time her voice was much smaller. Not everyone does. The pharmacist stood still. He was wise enough not to interrupt. Richard continued watching her with caution. You want me to believe that your mother is sick, that you came here alone with $10, and that in this entire city, there isn't a single person who can help you with 5 more? Annie nodded slowly. She looked at the small white medicine bag still waiting behind the counter, then back at Richard. Every bit of strength left in her seemed to gather into one final effort. If you don't believe me, she said, her voice low and tense, you can look at this. She held the prescription with both hands and offered it to him. Her fingers trembled at the edges of the paper. It has my mother's name on it, Linda Johnson. That's my mother. It says what she needs. It also says the clinic sent in the refill. Annie drew in a breath, trying not to let her voice break with fear. But the fear had soaked into every word. Please, sir. I know you don't owe me anything. I know $5 is still your money. But my mother is waiting for this medicine, and I've already been gone too long. Richard looked at the paper but did not take it yet. Annie held the prescription a little closer. The gesture was almost a plea, though her voice still held on to the last of its politeness. I'm not asking you to believe my whole life story. I'm only asking you to believe this paper. Believe the man behind the counter. Believe that I need to get this medicine out of here before my mother gets worse. The pharmacist placed the small box of medicine on the counter and spoke before Richard could answer. Mr. Whitmore, her mother really does need this medicine. His voice remained professional, but it had softened. This is an emergency inhaler, refilled through a clinic prescription. I saw a similar prescription last week. She isn't making this up. Annie gave the pharmacist a brief, grateful glance, then looked back at Richard. I'll give you any information you need to find me tomorrow, she said. My full name, where I work, where I live. I don't have much money, but I keep my word, please. I only need $5 right now. Finally, Richard took the prescription. His eyes moved across the printed lines. Patient name, dosage, physician, refill instructions. Linda Johnson, emergency inhaler, clinic refill. Nothing about it looked staged. Nothing in Annie's eyes looked like an act. He looked back at the $10 bill on the counter. $5. Less than the coffee his assistant usually bought him in the morning. Less than the parking fee in one of the buildings he owned. Yet tonight, those $5 stood between this young woman and the medicine that could help her mother keep breathing. Richard opened his wallet. Annie's eyes fell instinctively to the leather wallet, then immediately turned away, as if even watching him take out the money made her feel a little more humiliated. Richard pulled out a $5 bill and placed it on the counter. That covers it. Annie stared at the bill for half a second, then lifted her eyes. Thank you, sir. I'll pay you back tomorrow. I promise. You already said that. I mean it. I hope you do. The pharmacist took the money, completed the sale, and placed the inhaler into the white bag with the receipt. Annie took the bag carefully, not roughly, even though every part of her wanted to run out of there immediately. "Thank you," she said to the pharmacist. He nodded. "Get it to your mother." Annie turned to Richard. For one moment, she seemed to search for something bigger than thank you. Something that could restore a little of the dignity she had just been forced to lay down under the bright pharmacy lights. But no words came in time, so she only bowed her head once, small and sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I won't forget this." Then she pressed the medicine bag to her chest and hurried toward the front door. The automatic door closed behind Annie, and Richard Whitmore remained standing at the checkout counter with the unpaid bottle of aspirin in his hand. He looked through the glass front door. Annie hurried across the nearly empty parking lot, both hands pressing the small medicine bag beneath her thin coat, as if one careless movement might let the darkness reach out and snatch away the only thing keeping her mother alive. The pharmacist cleared his throat. "Sir, your aspirin." Richard turned back. He took out his card, paid, and slipped the bottle into his coat pocket without asking for a bag. The pharmacist hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She was telling the truth." Richard looked at him. "I'm not supposed to get involved in customers' personal matters," the pharmacist continued. "But she's been here before. Same prescription. Last time, she paid in full. Didn't ask for a discount. Didn't make a scene. Didn't make anyone uncomfortable." The guarded look remained on Richard's face. "You know her well?" "Not well. But well enough to know she isn't the kind of girl who makes up stories in a pharmacy at midnight." The pharmacist picked up the empty basket Annie had left near the counter and set it aside. "Her mother has been sick for a long time. They live in the building on Mason Street. That place isn't easy to live in when you have breathing problems." Richard's eyes moved back toward the front door. Annie had already turned the corner. The pharmacist handed him the receipt. $5 is nothing until someone doesn't have it." Richard said nothing. He slipped the receipt into his pocket and stepped outside. His driver immediately got out of the black sedan parked by the curb. "Home, Mr. Whitmore?" Richard's hand had already reached for the door handle, but then it stopped. At the end of the street, he caught a brief glimpse of Annie's thin coat as she hurried past a closed laundromat. "Stay with the car," Richard said. The driver paused. "Sir, I'll be back." Richard did not wait for another question. He turned and started walking down the sidewalk. He kept enough distance so Annie would not notice him. The street was quiet, but not completely empty. A bus hissed at the corner before pulling away, leaving behind a thin trail of exhaust and the smell of cold metal. A few storefront lights still glowed dimly, reflecting off the damp pavement. Annie walked fast. One hand held the medicine bag tightly beneath her coat, while the other pulled her collar up against the wind. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not only from the cold, but from urgency, from fear, from having run too long through a night in which she had no right to slow down. Richard followed her, still not fully understanding what was pushing him forward. His suspicion was still there, but the pharmacist's words would not leave his mind. She paid in full, last time. Her mother really was sick. The building on Mason Street, maybe Annie had told the truth, and if she had, Richard had spoken to her as if she were trying to cheat him out of $5. The thought made him uncomfortable. Annie turned onto Mason Street, where the buildings stood closer together, and the sidewalk was cracked, patched over with old slabs of cement. A row of low brick apartments stretched along the street, with metal fire escapes clinging to the outside walls like rusted bones. Some windows were tightly covered with curtains, others had towels stuffed along the frames to keep out the draft. Annie climbed the stairs to the second floor. Richard stopped near the entrance, half hidden beneath the shadow of the stairwell. He watched her reach the last door in the hall. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them once, then bent down to pick them up. Her fingers were shaking so badly that it took her 2 tries to fit the key into the lock. "Come on," she whispered. Her voice was soft enough not to wake the neighbors, but loud enough for Richard to hear. The lock clicked open. Annie pushed the door open before she had even pulled the key all the way out. "Mom," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "I got it. I'm here." Richard told himself he should stop there. He had only wanted to know whether she had really gone home. That was all. But the door did not close completely, and from where he stood, a sound drifted out that made him take a few steps up without thinking. It was breathing, not ordinary tired breathing. It was a thin, wheezing, broken sound, as if each breath was not being taken in, but dragged through a doorway too narrow inside the chest. Richard stepped onto the second-floor hallway and stopped a few feet from Annie's door. Inside was a small room, cramped and damp with cold. An old bed stood against the wall. A small table sat beneath the window. On it were several medicine bottles, a weak lamp, and a stack of bills arranged so neatly it hurt to look at them. A woman lay curled on the bed, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping a thin blanket. Her face was pale and exhausted, and each breath seemed harder than the one before. Annie dropped to her knees beside the bed and tore open the medicine bag. Her movements were quick, but not careless. She had done this before. That realization weighed on Richard more heavily than the sight in front of him. An 18-year-old girl should not be so practiced at fear. "Lift your head just a little, Mom," Annie said. "Just a little. I have the new inhaler." Linda Johnson tried to answer, but only a hoarse, broken sound came out. "Don't talk," Annie said quickly. "Please, Mom, don't talk. Just breathe when I tell you." She shook the inhaler, attached it to the spacer on the bedside table, and carefully helped her mother sit up a little higher. The blanket slipped down, and Annie caught it with her elbow while one hand stayed behind Linda's shoulder. There was almost no room left for Annie herself in that tiny room, but she still found a way to make her mother more comfortable. "That's it," Annie whispered. "Look at me, Mom. I'm right here. Breathe in slowly. One more time. Please, Mom. Just one more time." Linda tried to follow as best she could. The first breath was shallow. The second was a little better. The third still trembled, but it went deeper. Annie counted softly under her breath, her eyes fixed on her mother's face, as if she were reading every small change in her skin, her lips, and the sound of her breathing. Richard stood outside the door and suddenly remembered the aspirin in his coat pocket. He had walked into the pharmacy because of a headache. Annie had walked in because her mother could not breathe. If Annie's love for her mother touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Several minutes passed before Linda's chest began to settle. Not completely, not enough to call it peace, but enough for Annie to lower her head and press her forehead against her mother's thin hand. "You scared me so much," Annie whispered, so quietly Richard almost did not hear it. Linda's weak fingers brushed through her daughter's hair. "You got it?" "Yes," Annie swallowed hard. "I got it. You shouldn't have gone alone. I didn't have another choice." Linda turned her head slightly. At that moment, her eyes caught Richard standing outside the door. Annie followed her mother's gaze and froze. For 1 second, her whole body seemed to shrink inward. Then she immediately stood, still holding the inhaler in her hand. The shame that had just begun to settle appeared on her face again, this time even more painful, because the man had seen everything. The room, the old bed, her mother's breathing, and the truth she had been forced to beg him to believe. "Mr. Whitmore?" Richard did not step any farther inside. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you." Annie looked at him, then at her mother, then at the door that was still open. "You followed me? I wanted to make sure you got home safely." Even Richard could hear how unconvincing the answer sounded. Annie's expression changed. The hurt appeared before she could hide it. "You thought I was lying." Richard did not answer quickly enough. Annie gave one small nod, as if she understood. "I told you I would pay you back." Linda tried to push herself higher on the bed. "Annie," she said weakly. "Who is this man?" Annie turned back at once, concern overwhelming her embarrassment. "Mom, don't sit up. He's the man from the pharmacy. He lent me $5 for the medicine." Linda closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was exhaustion in them and a deep kind of shame. "I'm sorry," Linda said to Richard, her voice hoarse. "She shouldn't have had to ask you like that." Annie pressed her lips together. "Mom, please." "No," Linda said, then coughed softly. Annie immediately stepped closer, but Linda lifted a hand to stop her. "We'll pay you back." Richard looked at the two of them. Annie stood beside the bed in her thin, worn coat. Linda was still trying to steady each breath. The open medicine box lay on the blanket. The receipt had fallen to the floor. $5 had brought him all the way here, but now it no longer felt like money. It felt like an accusation. "There's no need to talk about that right now," he said. Annie looked at him with an expression that was both cautious and wounded. "There is, sir. It matters to us." "I understand." For the first time, Richard let his eyes move carefully around the room. He saw the old heater near the wall, the window frame sealed with tape, the stack of bills arranged too neatly on the small table. Someone had tried to keep order in a place where life kept taking things away. Near the bed, a small lamp cast a weak glow. Beside it was a framed photograph, turned slightly inward. Richard's gaze stopped on the frame for half a second. Annie noticed immediately. She shifted slightly, not rudely, but clearly, as if protecting the last bit of privacy she and her mother had left. "I should go," Richard said. Annie nodded, still tense. "Thank you for the $5. Richard turned toward the hallway, but stopped at the doorway. Linda's breathing was still not completely even, though it was better. Annie had already sat down beside her mother again, one hand close to the inhaler, ready in case the tightness returned. She leaned very low, whispering something to her mother, while she herself was still trembling from the cold, from exhaustion, and from the fear she had just survived. Richard stepped outside, but he did not leave the building right away. At the end of the hallway, he looked back one more time. Annie was still bent over her mother. She pulled the blanket higher over Linda, then silently picked up the receipt from the floor, smoothed it flat, and placed it on the table as if even a small piece of paper could not be allowed to go missing in a life this poor. Richard stood there, his hand resting on the freezing railing, and for the first time that night, his suspicion began to feel very small compared to his shame. Richard stayed at the far end of the walkway longer than he should have. He told himself he was only making sure Annie's mother did not need an ambulance. He told himself the pharmacist's warning about Mason Street and breathing problems had made him cautious. But those were clean explanations, and none of them felt fully true. Inside the apartment, Annie's voice remained low and steady. "Try one more breath, Mama. Not too fast. Good. That's better." Linda coughed, then pulled in air with less strain than before. Richard heard the old bed shift, heard Annie moving around the room, heard a glass being filled at the sink. He should have left then. Instead, he turned back. The door was still open a few inches. Richard raised his hand and knocked lightly against the frame. Annie looked up at once. Her whole body tightened, but she did not step away from her mother. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't want to intrude," Richard said. "I only wanted to ask if she needs a doctor." Annie glanced at Linda. "She says no." Linda gave a weak, embarrassed smile from the bed. "I've had worse nights." Annie turned to her quickly. "Mama." Linda closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. "All right. I've had nights I should have gotten help and didn't." Richard heard the difference. It was not stubbornness. It was the voice of someone who had learned to measure every decision by its cost. He looked toward Annie. "Has she been seen recently?" "At the clinic," Annie said. "Last week. The clinic told her to go to the emergency room if it got this bad again," Linda admitted, then looked away as if the sentence itself had shamed her. Annie's face changed. "You didn't tell me that. I didn't want you scared." "I was already scared." Linda reached for her hand. Annie gave it to her, but her eyes stayed wet with anger she would not release. Richard remained by the door, feeling out of place in a way he was not used to. Men opened doors for him. Assistants cleared rooms for him. In this apartment, even stepping over the threshold felt like a decision that needed permission. "May I come in?" he asked. Annie hesitated, then moved a stack of folded laundry from a chair near the table. "You can sit there. I won't stay long." She nodded, not quite trusting him, not rude enough to say so. Richard stepped inside. The apartment was smaller than it had looked from the walkway. A narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a hot plate near the sink, and a heater that clicked without giving much warmth. The walls had been wiped clean where hands could reach, but damp marks remained near the window. Someone had tried to make the place decent with very little. Annie noticed his eyes moving around and seemed to shrink under it. "We're cleaning tomorrow," she said quickly. "I was at work late." Richard looked at her. "I wasn't judging the room." Her expression said she did not fully believe him. Linda breathed in through her nose, slower now. "Annie keeps things better than I deserve." "Mama don't." "She does," Linda said to Richard. "Works mornings, helps me, still finds a way to make sure I eat before she does." Annie turned toward the small counter and picked up the pharmacy receipt, folding it once, then again. "You don't have to tell him all that." Richard watched her fingers smooth the receipt's edge. $5. She was still thinking about it. "I can call someone," he said. "A doctor. Someone who can come here tonight." Annie shook her head. "No, sir. We can't pay for that." "I did not ask if you could pay." Linda's eyes opened wider. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate what you already did, Truly. But we don't accept things we can't repay. That seems to run in your family, Richard said. Annie looked down. My father taught me that. Richard's gaze shifted to the table. There were papers stacked beside a lamp. Bills. Clinic forms. An old Bible with tape along the spine. Behind them sat a framed photograph. The frame had been rubbed thin at the edges, but the picture inside had been kept carefully. Richard looked once, then looked again. The man in the photograph wore a dark driver's uniform. He stood beside a younger Richard Whitmore in front of a black town car. The younger Richard had one hand on the open car door, impatient even then, already becoming the kind of man who expected the world to move on his schedule. The driver stood straight, calm, with a face Richard knew before his mind was ready to say the name. Richard rose from the chair. Annie followed his gaze and stiffened. That's private. Richard barely heard her. He stepped closer to the table but stopped before touching the frame. His voice came out lower than he expected. Where did you get this photograph? Annie stood between him and the table now, protective despite how tired she was. It's my father. Richard looked at her. Your father? Yes. What was his name? Annie's eyes narrowed slightly. Samuel Johnson. The name moved through Richard like a door opening in a wall he had stopped looking at years ago. Linda turned her head on the pillow. You knew Sam? Richard did not answer at first. He looked back at the photo, at the driver's uniform, at the face he had not seen in almost 2 decades except in memory. Samuel Johnson drove for me, he said. Annie's hand tightened around the receipt. No, my father was a driver, but he never talked about rich people much. Linda's voice softened. He talked about one. Not often. Only when Annie asked about the picture. Richard finally reached for the frame. Slowly, giving Annie time to stop him. She did not. He lifted it with both hands. The glass was clean. Someone had wiped it recently. I gave him this copy, Richard said. After a company dinner. He said his wife liked photographs, and I told him to take it. I had forgotten that. Linda gave a tired laugh that broke into a small cough. Annie moved at once, but Linda waved her off. He brought it home like it was something important, said, one day Annie will ask what her daddy did, and you tell her I drove for a man who needed looking after more than he knew. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Annie watched him carefully. How did you know him? Richard set the frame down with more care than he had shown anything that night. He was not just my driver. Linda's face changed. She knew what was coming, or at least part of it. Richard looked at Annie. Your father saved my life. Annie did not move. The words seemed too large for the small apartment. What? She whispered. Richard drew a slow breath. Years ago, there was a break-in at my house. It was not a simple robbery. I was careless. I walked into the wrong hallway at the wrong time. Samuel saw what was happening before I did. He pulled me back, took the hit meant for me. Linda's eyes filled, but she stayed quiet. Annie looked from Richard to the photograph. He never told me that. He would not have, Linda said. Your father didn't like making himself the hero of a story. Richard's jaw tightened. He should have. I owed him more than I gave. Linda turned her face toward him. He said you tried. I did try. Richard's voice sharpened. Not at her, but at himself. Then I let other people try for me. That is not the same thing. Annie stood very still. The receipt was crumpling in her hand now. After he got sick, we moved. We couldn't keep the old place. Mama said some letters might have gone there, but we never got them. Richard looked at the bills on the table, the heater, the damp window, the inhaler box on the bed. His mind put the pieces together before his heart accepted them. Samuel Johnson had once stood between Richard Whitmore and death. Years later, Samuel's daughter had stood in a pharmacy, humiliated over $5. Richard had looked at her and wondered whether she would cheat him. The shame came harder this time because it had a name attached to it. Annie, he said. She looked up, guarded again. I am sorry. She seemed confused by that. For the $5? For what I thought when you asked. Annie looked away first. You didn't know me. No, Richard said, but I knew enough to be kinder than I was. Linda's breathing caught again. Annie moved to her side, all else forgotten. She lifted the inhaler and checked the time on the pharmacy label. Richard watched her support her mother's shoulders with practiced care. Whatever truth had just been uncovered, Annie still had the same immediate task. Help her mother breathe through another hour. He took out his phone. Annie noticed. What are you doing? Calling my physician? Linda tried to protest. Mr. Whitmore? No. Richard's voice did not rise. But it ended the argument. Not this time. Annie stared at him. We can't afford a private doctor. Richard looked at the photograph of Samuel, then back at her. This is not about what you can afford. Annie's face tightened. She was too proud to accept help easily, too frightened to refuse it completely. Richard understood that now. He softened his tone. Let me make the call. After that, you can still decide what happens next. Annie looked at her mother. Linda's eyes had closed again. Her breathing better, but still thin. After a long moment, Annie nodded. Richard stepped closer to the window and made the call. His voice was quiet, precise, controlled in the way it became when he meant every word. This is Richard Whitmore. I need a doctor at the Mason Street units. Now. The call ended, but Richard kept the phone in his hand for a moment, as if the weight of it could steady him. On the other side of the small apartment, Annie helped Linda take another measured breath from the inhaler. Linda's shoulders had stopped pulling so hard with each breath, but the relief was thin, the kind that could vanish if the air turned against her again. How long? Annie asked without looking at him. 20 minutes, Richard said. Maybe less. Annie nodded, though her face tightened. A doctor coming here at this hour probably costs more than our rent. Do not think about the bill. That's easy for you to say. Richard accepted the words because they were true. He had said the same thing to many people over the years. Always as comfort, never realizing how empty it could sound to someone who measured life by what could be paid on Friday. Linda touched Annie's wrist. Annie, don't speak to him like that. No, Richard said. She has a right to. Annie looked at him, unsure what to do with that answer. She was used to defending herself. She was not used to being allowed to. Richard turned back toward the framed photograph on the table. The younger version of himself stared out from behind the glass, confident and impatient beside the black town car. Beside him stood Samuel Johnson, shoulders square, eyes direct, one hand resting lightly near the door handle. Richard remembered that hand. Samuel used it to open doors, carry luggage, steady an umbrella, stop an argument before it became something worse. He had been a driver by title. But never only that. How long did my father work for you? Annie asked. Almost 7 years. Her expression shifted. 7 years was too much time to be a footnote and too little for the life she had been told. He drove me during the years when Whitmore Holdings was becoming what it is now, Richard said. I was younger, less careful, more convinced I knew everything. Linda gave a faint breath that almost became a laugh. Sam said you were stubborn. Richard looked at her. He was generous. No, Linda said. He was accurate. For the first time that night, Richard almost smiled. It faded quickly. He had a way of correcting me without embarrassing me, Richard said. If I was late, he did not say I was late. He would say, Sir, people who wait too long start deciding whether they still respect you. If I snapped at someone, he would wait until we were in the car and say, a man can be busy without being small. Annie listened with both hands around the inhaler. The hurt in her face had changed. It was still there, but now it had been joined by hunger, the quiet hunger of someone hearing pieces of a person she had lost too early. He said that? She asked. He said many things I should have listened to sooner. Linda closed her eyes. That was Sam. Richard drew a breath. The apartment seemed to press the past closer around him. The night he saved me was in October. I remember because the city had just turned cold. I had hosted a dinner at my house. Investors, lawyers, 2 men from Boston who wanted to take half my company and call it guidance. Samuel drove the last guest out and came back through the service entrance because I had left some papers in the car. Annie sat slowly on the edge of the bed, still close enough to Linda to help her. What happened? 3 men had entered through the back of the house. They knew where the office was. They knew there was a safe. It was not random. Richard looked at the photograph again. I came downstairs because I heard glass. I was angry before I was afraid. That was my mistake. I thought anger made me in control. Linda opened her eyes. Sam heard them too? He saw one of them before I did. Richard's voice lowered. There was a man in the hallway. I turned the corner, and Samuel pulled me back so hard I hit the wall. I remember being furious for half a second. Then I saw the weapon. Annie's fingers tightened around the inhaler. Richard noticed and kept the details careful. Samuel shoved me behind him. He told me to get down and stay there. I didn't listen fast enough. He pushed me again. The next few seconds were confusion, noise, broken glass, men shouting. Samuel kept himself between me and the danger until security came through the side entrance. Linda turned her face away, but Richard still saw the pain move across it. He came home with bruises, she said quietly. A cut on his shoulder. He told me there had been an accident with the car door. Richard shut his eyes briefly. He lied to protect me from owing him too much. He lied because he didn't want me afraid, Linda said. Annie looked at her mother. You knew? Not all of it. Linda's voice was thin, but steady. I knew enough to know your father had done something brave and didn't want applause for it. Richard sat back down on the chair, though he did not rest. I offered him money, a promotion, a house, anything he wanted. He said no to most of it. That sounds like him, Annie said. He accepted medical leave when the old injury bothered him. Later, when he got sick, I was told arrangements were being made. Support for the family, expenses covered. I signed what I was given. I thought it was handled. Annie's eyes dropped to the bills on the table. It wasn't. No, Richard said. It wasn't. The words sat between them with more weight than accusation. Linda did not accuse him. Annie did not either. Somehow that made it worse. Richard looked at Linda. Why didn't you contact my office? Linda took a careful breath. I tried once after Sam passed. The number I had sent me through 3 people. One said someone would call back. No one did. Then we had to move. After that, I had no time to chase men in offices. I had a funeral bill, a sick body, and a daughter who still needed supper. Annie looked down when her mother said supper, as if remembering meals stretched too thin. Richard's jaw tightened. I should have come myself. You were running a company, Linda said. That is not an excuse. No, Linda said softly. But it is what happened. Annie stood and went to the small sink for water. She moved slowly now, the rush finally catching up with her. She filled a glass, brought it to Linda, then glanced at Richard. My father saved your life, she said, and tonight you thought I was trying to cheat you out of $5. There was no anger in her voice. That made it cut deeper. Yes, Richard said. I did. Annie nodded once, accepting the truth because there was nothing else to do with it. That hurt. I know. No, she said. You know it was wrong. That's not the same. Richard looked at her then. Really looked. The thin coat, the tired shoes, the face still marked by humiliation, but not defeated by it. Samuel's daughter had his spine. Richard saw it now and wondered how he had missed it in the pharmacy. You are right, he said. I do not know what it felt like. Annie seemed surprised that he did not defend himself. A knock sounded at the open door. A woman in a dark coat stood outside with a medical bag in one hand and a stethoscope around her neck. Dr. Elaine Porter, she said. Mr. Whitmore called me. Annie stepped back at once, worried again. She's on the bed. Her breathing got better after the inhaler, but it was bad before. Dr. Porter entered with calm efficiency. She greeted Linda by name, asked short questions, checked her pulse, listened to her lungs, and looked around the apartment without saying what everyone already understood. How long has this window been leaking air? The doctor asked. Linda looked embarrassed. A while. And the heater? It works when it wants to, Annie said. Dr. Porter glanced at Richard, then back at Linda. Mrs. Johnson, you need a hospital tonight. Not because anyone failed here, but because your lungs are working too hard and this apartment is not helping you recover. Annie's face drained. Hospital means paperwork. Bills. We can't. I'll handle it, Richard said. Annie turned sharply. You keep saying that. Because I mean it. Linda tried to sit higher. Mr. Whitmore, please understand. I won't have my daughter carrying debt because of me. Richard stepped closer, but kept his voice low. Mrs. Johnson, your husband once stood between me and a danger I did not see coming. Tonight I am standing here because your daughter asked for $5 she should never have had to ask for. This is not charity. This is a debt arriving late. Linda looked at him for a long time. Her pride fought with her exhaustion, and exhaustion was winning. Annie whispered, Mama, please. That word did what Richard's money could not. Linda looked at her daughter's face and stopped resisting. All right, she said, but Annie stays with me. Dr. Porter nodded. She can ride along. Richard took out his phone again. I'll have a car brought closer. No, Dr. Porter said. I called medical transport on my way. She needs oxygen during the ride. Annie moved fast after that, gathering Linda's sweater, her ID, the prescription slip, and a small plastic bag with 2 pill bottles inside. She checked everything twice. Richard saw her slip the pharmacy receipt into her pocket, the same receipt that proved she still owed him $5. A few minutes later, footsteps sounded on the metal stairs. Medical workers arrived with equipment and moved carefully through the narrow doorway. Annie stood back only when asked. Her hands clenched at her sides. As they prepared Linda to leave, Richard picked up the framed photograph of Samuel and set it upright on the table. The man in the picture looked out at the room with the same steady gaze Richard remembered. Linda noticed. Sam would hate all this fuss. Richard kept his eyes on the photograph. He would have helped anyway. Yes, Linda said. He would have. When they carried Linda toward the walkway, Annie followed close, one hand on the blanket near her mother's shoulder. At the door, she paused and looked back at Richard. Are you coming? The question was small, but it changed the air between them. Richard slipped the aspirin bottle from his pocket and set it on the table beside Samuel's picture. He had no use for it now. Yes, he said. I'm coming. The medical workers carried Linda down the metal stairs with Annie close behind them, one hand hovering near the blanket as if her touch alone could keep her mother steady. Richard followed a few steps back. The walkway smelled of old paint, damp concrete, and cooking oil from another apartment. A door opened halfway on the first floor, and an older man in a robe looked out, then lowered his eyes when he saw the stretcher. She all right? He asked. Annie answered before anyone else could. She will be. The man nodded, not convinced but respectful enough not to ask more. Tell your mama I'm praying. I will, Mr. Lewis. That small exchange told Richard something he had not understood when he first saw the building. People here noticed one another. They might not have much to give, but they noticed. He thought of his own building downtown, where neighbors rode private elevators and could live above one another for years without knowing a name. At the bottom of the stairs, Dr. Porter walked beside Linda while a paramedic checked the oxygen line. Annie stayed near the stretcher until the back doors of the medical van opened. Then she froze. What is it? Richard asked. Annie looked at the equipment inside, then at her mother's thin face beneath the hallway light. I forgot her purse. I'll get it. No. Annie turned quickly. I'll go. Her ID is in there. Insurance card too, even if it doesn't cover much. She ran back up before Richard could answer. He watched her move through exhaustion with the same urgency she had shown at the pharmacy. Every step said she had been doing this too long. Linda's eyes opened slightly. Mr. Whitmore? Richard stepped closer. I'm here. Don't let her blame herself. She shouldn't. She will. Linda's breath moved carefully through the oxygen mask. Annie thinks if she works hard enough, nothing bad can reach us. Her father was like that, took every burden and called it duty. Richard looked up toward the second-floor walkway where Annie had disappeared. Samuel carried more than I knew. Yes, Linda said. But he carried it standing straight. A few moments later, Annie returned with a worn purse tucked under her arm and a plastic bag of medicine in her hand. She climbed into the van beside Linda without asking permission. Dr. Porter looked at Richard. Northside Community, I'll call ahead. Richard nodded. I'll follow. Annie looked toward him from inside the van. You don't have to. I know. She seemed ready to argue, then looked at Linda and stopped. Okay. The van doors closed. Richard stood on the curb as it pulled away, red lights moving over the brick walls of the Mason Street units. His driver had brought the sedan closer and was waiting with the rear door open. Richard got in, but he did not settle into the seat the way he usually did. He sat forward, eyes on the medical van ahead. Northside Community Hospital, he said. Yes, sir. The drive was short, but it gave Richard too much time to think. The city passed by in uneven layers. Closed storefronts, late buses, diners with tired workers wiping counters, apartment windows glowing above dark sidewalks. Richard had seen these streets from behind tinted glass for years. Tonight they looked less like scenery and more like evidence. He remembered Samuel's steady voice in the car after long meetings. A man can be busy without being small. At the time, Richard had taken it as a clever remark from a loyal employee. Now it sounded like a warning he had ignored. At the hospital entrance, Annie was already out of the van, walking beside Linda's stretcher as staff guided them inside. Richard followed through sliding doors into the emergency department. The smell of disinfectant hit him first, then the layered noise, phones ringing, wheels over tile, a nurse calling for a chart, someone coughing behind a curtain. Annie handed over Linda's ID with both hands. The woman at intake asked for information, and Annie answered quickly, as if speed might make them safer. Address: Mason Street Units, Apartment 2C. Emergency contact? Me. Insurance? Annie gave the card and added before the woman could ask, "It doesn't cover much, but she has it." Richard saw her shoulders tighten, waiting for the cost to enter the room like another illness. The intake woman looked at the card, then at the screen. "We'll get her seen first." Annie nodded. "Thank you." A nurse led Linda through double doors. Annie tried to follow, but another nurse stopped her gently. "We'll call you back as soon as we can. She gets scared if she wakes up and I'm not there," Annie said. "I understand. Give us a few minutes." Annie stood there after the doors closed, still holding the purse, the medicine bag, and the folded receipt from the pharmacy. Richard came beside her, but not too close. "She is in the right place," he said. Annie looked at the doors. That's what people say when they can afford the right place. Richard had no answer that would not sound weak. They sat in the waiting area. Annie chose a chair near the doors, so she could stand quickly when called. Richard sat one seat away. A television mounted in the corner played a late news segment, with the sound low. Across the room, an older woman slept with a sweater folded under her head. A man in work boots rubbed his hands together and stared at the floor. Annie opened her mother's purse and began sorting papers. ID. Insurance card. Clinic notes. A folded list of medications. 2 bus passes. A photograph of Samuel, smaller than the one in the apartment. Richard noticed how careful she was with that picture. "You carry that with her?" he asked. Annie glanced at it. "Mama does. She says if she ever has to make a hard decision, she likes to remember what Daddy would have told her." What would he have told her tonight? Annie pressed the photo between her palms. To go to the hospital before it got this bad. Linda had known that too. So had Annie. The difference was money. A doctor came out after nearly half an hour. Dr. Porter was with him. Annie stood so fast the papers nearly slid from her lap. "She's stable," Dr. Porter said first, and Annie's face changed at that single word. "She's responding to treatment, but her oxygen levels were lower than I like. We're admitting her overnight, possibly longer, depending on the chest x-ray." "Is it pneumonia?" Annie asked. "Early signs. We caught it before it became worse, but she needs medication, monitoring, and rest." Annie nodded, taking in every word. "Can I see her?" "In a few minutes." Richard spoke then. "Doctor, what caused the decline?" Dr. Porter looked from him to Annie, then answered plainly. "Asthma can worsen for many reasons, but the apartment is part of it. Damp air, dust, poor heat, possible mold. If she goes back there too soon."